Thank you very much, and I hope people in the Bitcoin ecosystem have heard about RGB, which is smart contracts on Bitcoin and Lightning. And these smart contracts are quite different from everything that exists in this field today, not just other non-Bitcoin blockchain smart contracting platforms, but even for Bitcoin itself. It is the only smart contracting system that is done with a client-side validation. And today I will be telling more why it is important and what it will change. We say that the release of RGB, as it has grown over the many years, it's been in development in total for about 8 years already, is probably the biggest happening in Bitcoin since the release of Lightning Network. So through the slides, I will be explaining why it actually so. And this is also a biggest happening in free and open software, and this specific scene is dedicated to the free and open software because it has a vast body of the open source, and not just open source but free software code. It's licensed under Apache 2 license, and it's more than 1 million of lines of the code in total across multiple GitHub organizations and more than 50 repositories with more than 100 of libraries. So the client-side validation as a new concept, it required to develop a lot of base layers, which, like client-side validation, is more complex thing than blockchain itself. And that's why it resulted in such vast body of the code and libraries. And in total, it's also quite a decentralized thing. There is more than 100 individual contributors from more than 11 companies. And actually, there is no single for-profit company which stands behind RGB. There are many companies who are contributing or building to RGB, but it's unlike, for instance, Lightning, where there was Lightning Labs pioneering this. Here it's completely free and open source. Not just source code, but also the protocol itself and the core development. It also took us 9 years of research and 5 years of this recent implementation. We had not just to do the client-side validation and RGB, we had to develop a new Bitcoin wallet Rust libraries, not just Rust Bitcoin and Rust Miniscript, but a completely new ecosystem of Bitcoin libraries, and also do a new Lightning implementation and Rust, which is called LNP. We also had to do a lot of scientific advancements because client-side validation had required us to develop a new paradigm in the distributed computing, which is partially replicated state machines. So if you think about blockchain as every single node replicates all the data and it has access to all the data, so you know the global state of the whole world. Here, we don't have that. With the client-side validation, it is you have only the data which are relevant to you, and you validate your own data. So from a validation perspective, you have a partial access to the state of the global system. And that required a lot of advancements, also in computer science. It required developing a new virtual machine, a new data type system, and a new programming language. So we have started in 2016 with the idea of colored coins. And in 2019, we started bringing it further into something more complex and able to run the fully fledged smart contracts. So we added ability to handle arbitrary rich data and the virtual machine in 2021. Then we had to rewrite a lot of components of RGB because Taproot was released, and we decided that we would like to leverage the best technologies available with a Taproot release. We also had to advance further the smart contracting capability. So today you have not just Turing completeness, but you also have things like interfaces, inheritance, introspection of the smart contract over its own state and the state of other contracts. And we also quite recently added the support for the liquid. There was also a lot of work on RGB on Lightning. So we started in 2020 writing this new Lightning implementation from scratch. Because again, the reason why we had to do that is that RGB brings so profound changes that you can't utilize existing libraries. You don't have necessary APIs or changes possible which are required to get it working together with the client-side validation. Then there was a new implementation of RGB based on LDK, Lightning Development Kit. It's quite famous framework, also written in Rust. And it was Bitfinex team who developed it last year. And it is also an open source project, basically made independently. There is also ongoing work. There was a first version released last year of C Lightning plugin. So RGB would be fortunately also available not just for LDK users and this new LNP node, but also with a C Lightning. And this year we had a team, again it's an independent team, doing a first DEX on Lightning with RGB called KaleidosWap. And they announced this spring, and we hope that this autumn we will see this exchange running. And it will be basically the first decentralized exchange made with the Lightning network. And this is not the end of the story for Lightning, because we are doing research in advancing Lightning itself. And one of the things we are, for instance, working on are multi-peer channels called Nucleus, which will allow to solve the inbound liquidity problem for Lightning itself and make more efficient both exchanges or even DeFi using combination of RGB, multi-peer Lightning networks, and Bitcoin. At this moment, we are releasing the version 0.11, which would be the version, the most feature-complete version of RGB. We added a lot of new stuff to version 11, comparing to the previous release of version 0.10 last year. So we hope that with this version, there will be many new projects appearing, because there are already a number of projects which are in stealth mode preparing their products for the launch together with this version. And we hope there will be much more new projects appearing after the release. So the main question is always, when Mainnet? And like we all heard this question many times, and we had just one answer. We are not going to release Mainnet because we don't want to bring shitcoins to Bitcoin and Lightning. So it's a pure research and development project. Joking. So the actual reality is that it was this guy who prohibited us from releasing RGB because he was really afraid of shitcoins coming. And what we decided, we understood that basically he is this Italian mafia, and we have a solution for that. So we decided to move Italian mafia into purely research and development part. The LNPBP Standards Association was created in 2019, and it was a non-profit association managing the development and the main implementation of RGB. This year, so this is the first announcement, this year, later, we will create a new organization called RGB Consortium. Because in LNPBP, as I already told, we did a lot of other things like implementation of Bitcoin, of Taproot, of new Lightning network version, and so on and so forth. So these activities will continue, and the association will be transformed into LNPBP Labs. But there will be a new RGB consortium, a pure industrial consortium created between companies contributing and using RGB. And I wouldn't be a major part of it anymore, so I will continue doing with the Italian mafia some research and development, but the consortium will be managed by the members, and it will be with the consortium establishment, the RGB will fully pass into the stage where its development is decentralized and the protocol is not controlled by anybody. So, am I telling you that RGB will be in Mainnet soon? Well, the actual answer is that in RGB there is no net, and there is no mainnet thus, or testnet. The RGB is not a network, unlike Bitcoin and Lightning itself. So, the real answer, putting jokes aside, is that there is no point where you say that RGB is in mainnet or it is not in the mainnet. To explain that, I need to say a few words how RGB actually works. So there are many layer 1s, and actually, theoretically, nearly any layer 1 can run a client-side validation layer on top. We have developed RGB for Bitcoin only, so we don't support any other blockchains, but again, it's just an implementation feature. Theoretically, somebody can fork the code and use RGB on top of any blockchain at all. But because of this nature, in Bitcoin, we can also support multiple layer 1s, and later I will show you why it is really important. Here, I give an example of Bitcoin blockchain and Liquid blockchain, which we support today. And in the future, we will be deploying a dedicated client-side validation stateless blockchain, which is actually not even a blockchain. It was developed specifically for client-side validation. And I will be telling more about it at the end of the presentation. So we have multiple blockchains on the layer 1. And when we issue contract, somebody issues a contract. He has a full power to decide on top of which blockchains this contract will be working. So somebody can issue a token or contract or an application working with both Bitcoin and Liquid. And somebody else independently can issue a contract which works just with the Bitcoin blockchain with no Liquid support. And somebody else can do a contract which doesn't work with the Bitcoin blockchain even, but supports only the new platform. And also you can do a contract which can be bridging all these blockchains together, so it's kind of inter-blockchain interoperability layer for Bitcoin. And with this approach, you see that the same applies for Bitcoin mainnet and Bitcoin testnet. It is the contract issuer who decides where to issue the contract. And RGB is in mainnet the moment you issue RGB contract based on Bitcoin mainnet. So that's basically it. Or if you don't want to go mainnet, you can issue a contract based on Bitcoin testnet. And again, you have a full freedom of combination of the layer 1s, unless you can't, the only thing that you can do is to have a contract which operates on top of Bitcoin mainnet and Liquid testnet, so you can't combine mainnets with the testnets. But when you select where you issue on the mainnets or testnet, you have the freedom to decide which layer 1s to support. And the roadmap, so the only thing that we can do is we can recommend issuers to issue the contracts on the mainnet or not recommend. But I believe that probably we would never officially do a recommendation because it's always, there is no guarantee that you are back free, and maybe it would take 10 years of the use of the system like Bitcoin itself to make sure that it is stable enough. So what we do instead is we provide a launch, the roadmap for RGB itself, and each individual developer and each individual company is able to decide where they feel comfortable with the security level to go mainnet. So what we have done through this year is that we have completed internal audit in the second quarter of the year. We have thoroughly revised all the code base and documentation. So independent people from the team were looking the code which they haven't wrote and trying to understand it, asking the questions, checking against the docs, and so on and so forth. We have found a number of issues because of this process. After that, with the help of Bitfinex team and independent developers, a lot of end-to-end tests were developed. And actually, we have tested through this third quarter of this year very extremely advanced scenarios. Like we have hundreds of transfers happening between different wallets in different sequences with the different types of wallet descriptors, taproot, non-taproot, involving lightning channels, not involving lightning channels. They also have revealed a number of issues which we have already fixed through this year. And now we are entering the next phase with this autumn, which we call a first reckless products in mainnet. And I will be showing you an ecosystem a bit later, but basically a number of companies, including ourselves, are ready to release the first products on the mainnet. And of course, other people are free to join, but keep in mind that it is still reckless, and there is still quite a high probability of something being discovered, and which may lead to the funds loss or some unexpected problems. And together with that, we are also, with the support from Bitfinex, we are studying external audit, where the independent developers and companies will be involved in reviewing the RGB system. The main problem with external audit is that client-side validation is extremely different from the world of Solidity, Ethereum smart contracts, stuff that audit companies are used to audit. So they literally, you can't just hire somebody and they wouldn't understand at all how to see the system, and they have to like spend a half a year studying it first. So that's why we are selecting those developers who were already contributing or working with RGB or interested in RGB and had a very high profile as cryptographers, and we invite them to help with the audit. So basically anybody interested in joining, you can contact me or a Bitfinex team. I will be bringing you to Bitfinex anyway, and participate the audit process. And after that, we will have a bounty programs and everything, so it will be ongoing process of making sure that RGB is stable. And today we already have quite a large ecosystem, a number of companies working on wallets, bridges, exchanges, asset explorers, and there is already a set of venture funds who does investments into RGB-based startups and products. And the recently announced Plan B fund, one of its directions of activity would be probably support of RGB startups. And there are also incubators appearing, supporting early stage products built on RGB. I will highlight the most interesting things. I believe this project, KaleidoSwap, is, I'm not participating in this project, so it's just an independent team who worked on different exchanges, and they built a DEX basing on the Bitfinex implementation of RGB on top of LDK. And they were demonstrating it on the Lightning Summit this April. So we hope that in the autumn, you will be able to play with this exchange in at least test mode. The other thing that I built myself is the color shift. It will be a bridge operating between different assets outside of RGB ecosystem and RGB ecosystem, because if you have an exchange, you need to have at least one trading pair. And the first thing that we will do will be bridging USD Tether into RGB and Lightning. The final part, so I explained what happens to RGB and the release of RGB, and the second part is why it will change everything. Because most of people think of RGB like, okay, you bring shitcoins on Lightning and Bitcoin, like that's it. Why should I be interested? Why it really matters for Bitcoin? I'm just a holder. But the reality is that the project of RGB is not about building shitcoins. It has an ambition of changing Bitcoin itself, but not through the soft forks, but through the new methods of working with the decentralized systems. So we already have affected Bitcoin landscape quite a lot. So I already said we wrote a new Rust Lightning implementation. We were the people who implemented Taproot in last Bitcoin. Back when the Taproot was activated. We also did a first Taproot multi-sig with a time lock wallet, not RGB specific, just pure Bitcoin. It's called My Citadel, and we created a whole Bitcoin library ecosystem. But other than that, RGB and client-side validation resolves the main problem with Bitcoin we have today. And these main problems are privacy and lack of programmability. And privacy probably is the most important part of this story, because when you have the transaction graph put into the blockchain, you're exposing this information about transaction graph to the whole world. And even if you use Liquid with the confidential transactions, the graph is still out there. And client-side validation allows you to hide this graph on the client side. So there is no public registry or ledger where your transactions are present. So nobody knows about them unless you expose them. And it's the best approach to the privacy. And at the same time, it's the best approach for scalability because now you don't need to have the whole world validating your transactions. It's just you and the future users of the same system or of your state will be validating it. So we say that client-side validation releases Bitcoin from the chains of blockchain. And the blockchain is the main problem of Bitcoin. And with that, you can do much more than when you strangled with Bitcoin inside blockchain itself. There are other things which happens due to client-side validation. One of them, which is also part of RGB, is the new identity standard, self-sovereign identity, SSI. And unlike many other proposals of identity based on Bitcoin or blockchain, it has the main point, distinction point, which is you don't need to own a UTXO or you don't need to create a Bitcoin transaction in order to create an identity. With existing proposals like ION or a new proposal from Sailor, you always have to create a blockchain transaction when you create an identity. And this literally doesn't scale. You can't have you need probably billions and billions of identities, and for that you will need to do a billions of Bitcoin transactions. And identity creation is not cheap. Here, you don't need to have a Bitcoin transaction, and that's the power of client-side validation. Another important advancement is that now we have a client-side apps. And unlike dApps in other smart contracting systems where you have a website and front end, which can be turned down, or developers of which can be found guilty by some regulators, like happened with the Tornado Cache, here you don't need any DNS name or website server to be run in order to interact with the smart contract. Because the smart contract is client-side, you send the data peer-to-peer between the users of the contract, and these users include the web front end, which will be running right locally on your mobile phone or desktop computer, and you will be interacting with it in a local manner. So this is also a very important solution for those who just even use Bitcoin itself with no other tokens, because you can build Bitcoin apps with this client-side validation and no point of centralization. There is another thing which comes with RGB, it's called Radiant, and it's trustless Bitcoin bridge. I don't have time to cover how specifically it works, but the core idea is that we use advanced protocol of verification and arbitration, which allows you to do the peg-ins and peg-out in decentralized way from Bitcoin itself into the RGB. And I already mentioned the Prime, which is a new layer 1 for Bitcoin made with a client-side validation. And the main feature, it's not blockchain, it's layer 1. You can have RGB operating on top of that, but it doesn't have coins, it doesn't have any state data. It's basically a sequence of hashes of Merkle root trees. And because of that, because you don't need to have initial blockchain sync, you don't need to validate blockchain, you can achieve a amazing speed, like up to 20 million of transactions per second, significantly exceeding what is possible with the K rollups or what is possible together for Visa and MasterCard networks. So this can work at the scale which exceeds the current needs of the humanity. And it grows just with the 6 gigabytes per year. And we are working on further improving it with a zero-knowledge, recursive zero-knowledge compression, so you can have a constant size client-side data, like 2 megabytes, which you send peer-to-peer, and that's it. There is no blockchain, there is no miners to contact, and by doing that, we can revive the spirit of P2P, original spirit of P2P, which was seen as a blockchain future, but we see that without removing blockchain, it wouldn't be possible. So the end goal which we have is transplanting Bitcoin from Bitcoin blockchain into the client-side validation world, such that initially we move Bitcoin from layer 1 to layer 2 in RGB with this Radiant bridge. And then eventually Bitcoin blockchain will be used less and less. Of course, it will probably happen after the main mining has completed to Bitcoin and will take more than a decade. But eventually, we will be able to operate without the constraints of blockchain. So with all of that, do we actually need all these new quote-unquote fancy features which are everybody talking about, like let's do a soft fork, introduce opcat, or do a drive chains, or build a new Bitcoin layer 2s with all these things which are hyping these days? Well, actually, we already have programmability with RGB and client-side validation without any soft fork. And we can have it with the privacy included. So we can upgrade Bitcoin without trying to reach a consensus, talking to miners, or asking regulators to regulate. So that's the way we have see forward. And this more broad view of client-side validation, which includes not just RGB smart contracts, but other components, which I briefly described, is called Ultraviolet, like a shift from just visual spectrum into the more short wave radiation. Thank you very much. Questions? Or we don't have time.
We got a few minutes if there's any questions, but let's keep them short.
Hi, thanks. Last year we saw the LDK interoperability with the existing Lightning Network as a service on top, a daemon on top. Could you just briefly explain how LNP works and does it actually interrupt with the existing Lightning Network?
Yeah, LNP is just another implementation of Lightning Network standards and protocol. So it works in Bitcoin-only mode, and in that mode it interacts with the other network. But it can support RGB-enabled channels. And overall, how RGB interacts with the Lightning Network is that if you have RGB channel, you can, of course, use other assets than Bitcoin. Or if you'd like to route the payment, you have three options. First of all, you either use Bitcoin, so in this way you always still have a Bitcoin in your RGB channel, or the next node can act as a DEX and it can change the assets on the fly from one asset into Bitcoin and forward through the parts of the Lightning Network which don't support RGB. So all these networks are interoperable in this way. Or you can find, of course, a chain of channels which has your asset and sufficient liquidity.
Good, awesome. Another round of applause. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.